In remote Scotland, a desperate single mother discovered that $500 gambles can uncover $280 million secrets. Sarah Martinez wasn't your typical castle owner. For years, she juggled 2 jobs while raising her daughter alone in cramped Chicago apartments. When 8-year-old Emma explored their crumbling Highland castle purchase, they stumbled upon Renaissance artifacts hidden since World War II. Sarah's impulsive auction bid would attract international art smugglers and spark a deadly battle over stolen Nazi treasures. What began as an escape from eviction became a fight for survival against ruthless criminals who'd searched decades for these priceless artifacts. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah Martinez stared at the eviction notice taped to her apartment door, the red lettering blurring through tears she refused to let fall. Not in front of Emma. Never in front of Emma. Mama! 8-year-old Emma peered around the corner from their cramped living room, her voice carrying that careful tone children use when they sense something's wrong but don't want to make it worse. Is everything okay? Everything's fine, sweetheart. The lie came easily now, practiced from months of hiding their deteriorating situation. Sarah crumpled the notice and shoved it into her purse alongside the stack of overdue bills that had become her constant companion. Go finish your homework. I need to look at something on the computer. Emma's dark eyes, so much like her father's, though Sarah tried not to think about that, studied her mother's face with an intensity that sometimes unnerved Sarah. At 8, Emma already possessed an intuitive understanding of adult stress that no child should need. Are we going to have to move again? Emma asked quietly. The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. They'd moved 4 times in the past 2 years, each apartment smaller and cheaper than the last, following the downward spiral that began when David walked out. He'd taken everything, their savings, their credit, even the car, leaving behind only his debts and a daughter who still asked when Daddy was coming home. Maybe, Sarah said, forcing lightness into her voice. But if we do, it might be somewhere really special this time. Emma's face brightened slightly, and Sarah felt the familiar weight of guilt. Another promise she might not be able to keep, another hope she might have to crush. Sarah settled into the second-hand chair that served as their office furniture and opened her laptop, a relic from her college days that wheezed through even the simplest tasks. The screen illuminated her face, casting shadows under eyes that carried the exhaustion of working 2 jobs while raising a daughter alone. She'd been researching housing assistance programs for hours, following dead-end links and filling out applications that led nowhere. The waiting lists were years long, the requirements increasingly impossible. Her art history degree, which once seemed like the foundation for a bright future, now felt like expensive wallpaper, decorative but useless. A pop-up ad flickered across the screen. Estate auctions, unique properties worldwide. Sarah's finger hovered over the X to close it, but something made her pause. Maybe it was the exhaustion, or the weight of the eviction notice in her purse, or the memory of Emma's question about moving somewhere special. She clicked. The site was professional, glossy, filled with photographs of mansion estates and historic properties that sold for millions. Sarah almost closed it immediately. These were dreams for people who lived in different worlds. But curiosity, that old graduate student instinct, made her scroll down to the low reserve auctions section. That's where she saw it. Castle Ravens Hollow, Scotland. Current bid, £350. The photograph showed a massive stone structure rising from misty Scottish hills, its towers reaching toward gray skies like something from Emma's beloved fairy tale books. The description was brief. 16th century castle in need of restoration. Remote Highland location. Sold as is. Sarah's breath caught. A castle. A real castle for less than $500. Her practical mind immediately began listing reasons this was insane. The restoration costs would be astronomical. They had no money for international travel. She knew nothing about Scottish property law or immigration requirements. The location was described as remote, which could mean anything from peaceful countryside to completely uninhabitable. But as she stared at the photograph, something shifted inside her chest. For the first time in months, She felt something other than the constant pressure of impending disaster. She felt possibility. Mama, look what I drew. Emma appeared beside her chair, holding up a piece of construction paper covered in crayon marks. The drawing showed two stick figures, one tall, one small, standing in front of what was unmistakably a castle, complete with towers and flags. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. That's beautiful, sweetheart. What made you think of castles? Emma shrugged with the casual wisdom of childhood. I was thinking about knights and princesses, and how they were brave even when scary things happened. She studied her mother's face. Are you looking at castles too? Sarah glanced back at the screen, where Castle Ravenshollow waited in digital silence. The auction timer showed 3 hours remaining. Current bid, £380. I was just looking at pictures, Sarah said carefully. It's pretty, Emma said, leaning closer to the screen. Does anyone live there? I don't think so, baby. Says it needs fixing up. Emma was quiet for a moment, her 8-year-old mind working through some internal calculation. If someone bought it and fixed it up, they could live there like in stories. Like they could have their own castle and be safe from bad guys. The words hit Sarah like a revelation. Safe from bad guys. Safe from eviction notices and mounting debts and the constant fear that kept her awake at night. Safe from the humiliation of food stamps and second-hand clothes and the way other parents looked at Emma with that careful pity reserved for children whose fathers disappear. She thought about David, about how he'd promised her the world and left her with nothing. About the dreams they'd shared, the house they'd planned to buy, the family they'd build, the future that crumbled the moment the pregnancy test showed 2 lines instead of 1. You dropped out to have a baby with me, he'd said during their last fight. That's not my fault you gave up your potential. But maybe he was wrong. Maybe this moment, this impossible possibility glowing on her laptop screen, wasn't about giving up. Maybe it was about claiming something bigger than the small, scared life she'd been settling for. Sarah checked her bank balance. $847.23. It was supposed to last until her next paycheck, supposed to cover groceries and utilities and Emma's school supplies. It was supposed to be responsible. But responsibility hadn't saved their marriage. Responsibility hadn't kept them from sliding toward homelessness. Responsibility felt like another word for slow surrender. Mama! Emma's voice seemed to come from very far away. Are you crying? Sarah realized she was. But for the first time in months, they weren't tears of desperation. They were something else entirely. She clicked the bid button. For £100. The system asked for confirmation. Her finger trembled over the trackpad. This was insane. This was financial suicide. This was exactly the kind of impulsive decision that practical people warned against. She thought about Emma's drawing, about stick figures standing brave in front of a castle, about being safe from bad guys. She clicked, confirm. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of nervous energy and competing bids. Sarah found herself in a digital war with anonymous strangers, each increment carrying her further from rational decision-making and closer to something that felt like destiny. At £480, most bidders dropped out. Only one remained. Username, propertyinvestor_UK, who seemed determined to acquire the castle for reasons Sarah couldn't fathom. With 10 minutes remaining, the bid sat at £520. Sarah had already exceeded her bank balance, relying on the overdraft protection she'd sworn never to use. Her hands shook as she entered £540. Propertyinvestor_UK immediately countered £560. Sarah's throat constricted. She couldn't go higher. She'd already risked everything they had and more. The timer ticked down. 5 minutes. 4. 3. At 2 minutes and 37 seconds, Propertyinvestor_UK's bid was automatically retracted. Insufficient funds. Sarah stared at the screen in disbelief. She'd won. She'd actually won. Congratulations, the system announced. You are the successful bidder for Castle Ravenshollow. Total cost, including fees, £561.50. Sarah's head spun with the magnitude of what she'd just done. She'd spent their last money on a castle she'd never seen, in a country she'd never visited, based on a photograph and a child's drawing. "Emma," she called, her voice surprisingly steady. "Come here, sweetheart. I have something to tell you." Emma appeared instantly, as if she'd been waiting just out of sight. Her face was expectant, hopeful in the way that broke Sarah's heart, because it suggested Emma had been hoping for good news for so long. "You know how we might have to move again?" Sarah began. Emma nodded solemnly. "Well, I found us a new place to live. Somewhere very special. Somewhere magical." "Where?" Emma's whisper was barely audible. Sarah turned the laptop screen toward her daughter, showing the photograph of Castle Ravenshollow rising from the Scottish mist like something from dreams. "We're going to live in a castle," Sarah said, the words sounding impossible even as she spoke them. "A real castle in Scotland. Our castle." Emma's eyes widened until they seemed to take up half her face. For a moment, she was completely silent, processing this information with the serious consideration she gave to all important matters. Then she launched herself into Sarah's arms with such force that the chair rolled backward. "We're going to live in a castle?" Emma's voice was muffled against Sarah's shoulder. "Like really and truly?" "Really and truly," Sarah confirmed, holding her daughter tight and trying not to think about all the ways this could go wrong. "We're going to have an adventure." Emma pulled back, her face radiant with joy. "Are there towers? Can I have a tower room? Are there secret passages?" Sarah laughed, the first genuine laugh she'd had in months. "I don't know, baby. I guess we'll find out together." Over the next week, Sarah moved through the logistics of their impossible journey with the methodical determination that had carried her through art history research papers and double shifts at the hospital. She sold everything they couldn't carry: furniture, electronics, books that had once seemed essential but now felt like anchors to a life that hadn't worked anyway. Emma helped with the peculiar wisdom children bring to major transitions. She sorted her possessions into essential and maybe someday piles, carefully packing her favorite books about castles and knights alongside the few toys that had survived their previous moves. "Are you scared, Mama?" Emma asked one evening as they ate dinner surrounded by cardboard boxes. Sarah considered lying, offering the comfortable reassurance adults traditionally provide children. But Emma deserved better than comfortable lies. "Yes," Sarah admitted. "I'm terrified. I've never done anything like this before." Emma nodded thoughtfully. "But sometimes being brave means being scared and doing something anyway. Right?" "Right," Sarah agreed, marveling at her daughter's insight. "Sometimes the scariest things turn out to be the most important things. Like when knights went on quests," Emma said. "They were scared of dragons. But they went anyway because the quest was important." Sarah smiled. "Exactly like that." The morning of their departure, Sarah stood in their empty apartment and felt the weight of everything they were leaving behind. The life with David that had promised so much and delivered so little. The dreams of graduate school and academic success that had been shelved indefinitely. The safety of the familiar even when familiar meant struggling. But as she watched Emma skip toward the taxi that would take them to the airport, clutching a backpack stuffed with castle books and wearing the excited expression of someone heading toward adventure rather than uncertainty, Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt like herself again. Not David's abandoned wife or the single mother barely making ends meet, but Sarah Martinez, the woman who had once believed she could research her way through any problem, who had dreamed of studying art in European museums, who had raised her hand in graduate seminars and defended ideas with passionate certainty. Maybe that woman had just been dormant, waiting for the right moment to resurface. Maybe it took something as impossible as buying a castle to remember who she was before life taught her to settle for less. "Ready, Mama?" Emma called from beside the taxi, her voice carrying across the courtyard like a challenge to the future. Sarah picked up their last suitcase, took one final look at the apartment that had sheltered them but never felt like home, and walked toward their new life. "Ready," she said, and meant it. The taxi pulled away from everything they'd known, heading toward the airport in Scotland and a castle that might be their salvation or their biggest mistake. But as Emma pressed her face to the window and narrated their journey with the enthusiasm of someone who believed in happy endings, Sarah realized the destination mattered less than the fact that they were finally moving toward something instead of away from everything else. For the first time in years, they were heading toward a dream instead of running from a nightmare. And sometimes, Sarah thought as Chicago disappeared behind them, that was the only difference between desperation and hope. The taxi driver's face in the rearview mirror told Sarah everything she needed to know about their destination before they'd even glimpsed the castle. His initial cheerful chatter had died somewhere between Glasgow and the Highland roads, replaced by increasingly doubtful glances and muttered comments about tourists not understanding what they're getting into. "You sure this is right, love?" he asked for the third time, squinting at the GPS that had lost signal 20 minutes ago. "Castle Ravensshallow's been empty for years. Nobody goes up there anymore." Emma pressed her face to the window, watching the landscape transform from rolling hills to something wilder, more ancient. The roads had narrowed to single lanes with occasional passing places, bordered by stone walls that looked older than countries. Sheep-dotted fields that seemed to stretch toward mountains shrouded in mist. "It's like a fairy tale," Emma whispered, her breath fogging the glass. Sarah wished she shared her daughter's wonder. Each mile from civilization made her decision feel more reckless. Her phone had lost signal an hour ago. The villages they passed grew smaller and more scattered until they disappeared entirely, leaving only endless moorland and the occasional cottage that looked abandoned. "There," the driver said suddenly, pointing up a winding track that branched off the main road. "That's your castle." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Castle Ravenshollow rose from the Highland mist like something from a fever dream. Massive stone walls climbed toward gray sky, their surfaces weathered by centuries of Scottish weather. The central keep soared 4 stories high, flanked by towers that seemed to pierce the low-hanging clouds. Even from a distance, Sarah could see gaps in the roof where slates had fallen away, and ivy that had claimed entire sections of the outer walls. It was magnificent. It was terrifying. It was completely, utterly uninhabitable. "Jesus," the driver breathed. "You bought that." Emma bounced in her seat. "It's perfect. Look at the towers, Mama. There's got to be secret passages and everything." The taxi struggled up the narrow track, bouncing over potholes that seemed designed to discourage visitors. Ancient oak trees lined the path, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the already dim Highland light into something ethereal and green. As they climbed higher, Sarah caught glimpses of the castle through the trees. Stone walls that seemed to go on forever, windows dark as empty eye sockets. "Right then," the driver said as they finally reached what passed for a courtyard. Weeds grew between ancient cobblestones, and a fountain in the center had long since crumbled into a pile of moss-covered stones. "This is as far as I go." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Sarah stared up at the castle's imposing facade. Up close, the magnitude of decay was overwhelming. The main entrance was secured with modern boards nailed over what had once been massive wooden doors. Windows were either boarded up or simply empty holes in the stone. Water stains traced dark paths down the walls where gutters had failed. The keys should be. Sarah checked her phone, realized she had no signal, then remembered the email she'd printed before leaving Chicago, hidden by the main entrance, under a loose stone marked with an X. The driver helped them unload their meager luggage, accepting his fare with obvious reluctance to leave them in such a place. "You've got provisions, right?" "Nearest village is Glenmore, about 8 miles back down the mountain. Nothing much there, just a pub and a few shops." "We'll be fine," Sarah said with more confidence than she felt. "No electricity up here," the driver continued, apparently feeling obligated to catalog the disasters awaiting them. "No running water either, I'd guess. Old place like this." He shook his head. "You sure about this?" Emma had already found the marked stone and was wrestling with something underneath it. "Got it," she called, holding up an enormous iron key that looked like it belonged in a medieval movie. The taxi disappeared down the track, leaving them alone with the weight of Highland silence. Without the engine noise, Sarah became aware of sounds she'd never heard in Chicago. Wind through stone, the distant cry of something that might have been a bird, the rustle of unseen creatures in the overgrown gardens. "It's so quiet," Emma whispered, then raised her voice experimentally. "Hello, castle." Her greeting echoed off the walls, coming back to them transformed and strange. Sarah approached the main entrance, studying the boards that covered what she assumed were the original doors. But Emma had already discovered something else. A smaller door set into the stone, nearly invisible unless you knew where to look. "Mama, this one's not locked." The door opened with a groan that seemed to come from the stones themselves. Beyond lay darkness so complete that Sarah instinctively reached for a light switch that didn't exist. "We need flashlights," she said, digging through her purse for the small LED light she always carried. Its beam cut through the darkness, revealing stone walls, arched ceilings, and corridors that seemed to stretch into infinity. They stepped inside together, their footsteps echoing in the vast space. The flashlight beam revealed glimpses of their new home. Stone floors worn smooth by centuries of use, massive wooden beams overhead, alcoves that had once held torches. The air smelled of age and abandonment, with undertones of damp stone and something Sarah couldn't identify but that reminded her of old books. "Look at this place," Emma breathed, spinning in a slow circle as Sarah's light played across walls that seemed to rise forever. "It's like we're inside a real fairy tale." They began to explore systematically, room by room. The great hall was cavernous, with a fireplace large enough to roast an entire deer. Tattered remains of tapestries still clung to the walls, their once bright colors faded to whispers of blue and gold. A massive wooden table sat in the center, scarred and stained but still solid. The kitchen was a nightmare of rusted implements and stone surfaces that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in decades. But Emma found wonder even here, climbing onto ancient counters and declaring it perfect for making feasts. "Mama, there's no refrigerator," Emma observed. "No electricity," Sarah reminded her, trying not to think about the implications. "We'll have to figure things out as we go." They climbed a stone staircase that spiraled upward into darkness, Sarah's flashlight beam dancing ahead of them. The second floor revealed bedrooms with collapsed furniture and windows that let in more weather than light. One room still contained the remains of a four-poster bed, its curtains reduced to tatters that moved in drafts from gaps in the stone. "This one's mine," Emma announced, standing in a smaller chamber that overlooked the courtyard. Afternoon light streamed through a window that had somehow kept most of its glass, illuminating walls covered in faded painted flowers. "It needs some work," Sarah said carefully. "All the best places do," Emma replied with 8-year-old pragmatism. "We can fix it together." They were exploring the third floor when Sarah heard the sound of a car engine in the distance. Through a grimy window, she watched a small red vehicle navigate the track they'd climbed earlier. "Someone's coming," Sarah said, feeling suddenly vulnerable. She'd been so focused on the logistics of getting here that she hadn't considered who might know about their arrival, or what their intentions might be. The car stopped in the courtyard, and a woman emerged. Even from 3 floors up, Sarah could see she was older, well-dressed in that particularly British way that suggested both practicality and respectability. She moved with purpose, studying the castle's facade before approaching the main entrance. "Hello?" The woman's voice carried clearly in the Highland air. "Is someone there? I'm Dr. Blackwood." Sarah and Emma made their way back down the stone stairs, Sarah's mind racing through possibilities. Dr. Blackwood could be anyone. A neighbor, a government official, someone connected to the previous owner. In her rush to escape Chicago, Sarah had done minimal research about Scottish property law or what obligations came with castle ownership. They found Dr. Blackwood waiting by the small side door, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and keen eyes that took in every detail of Sarah and Emma's appearance. "You must be the new owners," Dr. Blackwood said, her accent carrying the educated tones of someone who'd spent time in universities. "Dr. Margaret Blackwood. I live in Glenmore Village. Word travels fast in small communities. We heard Thomas Fletcher's castle had finally been sold." "Sarah Martinez," Sarah replied carefully. "This is my daughter Emma." "You knew the previous owner?" "Thomas Fletcher was A complicated man? Dr. Blackwood said, her gaze shifting to study the castle's walls with the intensity of someone reading a familiar book. Brilliant historian, but reclusive. Lived here alone for over 30 years. Rarely came to the village except for supplies. Emma stepped forward with the fearlessness of childhood. Did he know about secret passages? Every castle has secret passages. Dr. Blackwood's stern expression softened into something approaching a smile. Well, I suppose every castle should have secret passages. Thomas would have appreciated that observation. He was quite fond of castle architecture. We just arrived, Sarah said. We're still figuring things out. Dr. Blackwood's keen eyes took in Sarah's obvious exhaustion, Emma's excited energy, and their minimal luggage. From America by your accents. Long journey for such a remote purchase. Most people want to see a property before buying, especially one in Ravenshallow's condition. The observation wasn't accusatory, but Sarah felt defensive nonetheless. It was an opportunity we couldn't pass up. I'm sure it was, Dr. Blackwood replied, though her tone suggested she understood there was more to the story. And you're planning to live here? The castle hasn't had proper utilities in decades. We'll manage, Sarah said, hearing the edge in her own voice and trying to soften it. They needed allies, not suspicions. Dr. Blackwood studied them both for a long moment, then seemed to reach some internal decision. Have you eaten? There's a tea shop in the village, nothing fancy, but Mrs. Campbell makes excellent shortbread. We could discuss some of the practical considerations of Highland living. Emma looked at Sarah with hopeful eyes. The castle exploration had revealed their complete lack of preparation for medieval living. No running water, no electricity, no way to prepare food or heat the vast spaces. That's very kind, Sarah said. But we should probably get settled first. Mama, Emma said quietly, I'm really hungry. Of course she was. They'd been traveling for over 20 hours, living on airport snacks and airplane peanuts. Sarah's own stomach cramped with hunger. But more than that, she realized they needed help. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. Tea sounds wonderful, Sarah admitted. Dr. Blackwood nodded approvingly. Excellent. Follow me down to the village. We can talk about Thomas Fletcher and what you've gotten yourselves into. As they prepared to leave, Emma ran ahead to the car, but Dr. Blackwood lingered, studying the castle's facade with intense focus. Dr. Blackwood? Sarah said. Is something wrong? The older woman was quiet for so long that Sarah wondered if she'd heard the question. Finally, Dr. Blackwood spoke, her voice thoughtful and troubled. Thomas Fletcher spent his entire adult life researching this castle's history. He was obsessed with something he'd found in the archives, some connection to events during the Second World War. He never told anyone exactly what he'd discovered. But she paused, glancing toward Emma, who was examining Dr. Blackwood's car with fascination. He once told me that Ravenshollow held secrets that certain people would kill for. A chill ran down Sarah's spine that had nothing to do with the Highland wind. What kind of secrets? He never said. But a man doesn't spend 30 years alone in a crumbling castle without good reason. Dr. Blackwood's eyes met Sarah's. I hope, for your sake and your daughter's, that you're prepared for whatever Thomas might have left behind. As they drove down the winding track toward Glenmore Village, Sarah glanced back at Castle Ravenshollow rising from the mist. From this distance, it looked romantic, mysterious, full of possibility. But Dr. Blackwood's words echoed in her mind. Secrets that certain people would kill for. For the first time since winning the auction, Sarah wondered if her desperate gamble had bought them safety or delivered them directly into danger. And as the castle disappeared behind the ancient oaks, she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in those stone walls, something was waiting to be discovered. Something that would change everything. Emma's excited voice echoed through the castle's stone corridors at dawn. Sarah woke on the cold floor where they'd huddled together, wrapped in every piece of clothing they owned. Mama! Secret stairs in the tower. Sarah's heart hammered as she grabbed her flashlight. In Chicago, Emma's adventures meant skinned knees. Here, crumbling stones could mean death. She found Emma in the tower's main chamber, pressing against a wall where one stone protruded slightly. Before Sarah could stop her, Emma pushed. The stone rotated inward with a grinding sound, revealing darkness beyond. "It's a real secret passage," Emma whispered, slipping past Sarah before she could react. "Emma, come back!" But her daughter had already disappeared down narrow stone steps carved into living rock. Sarah followed reluctantly, her flashlight beam revealing walls smoothed by centuries of craftsmanship. The steps opened into a circular chamber that made Sarah's art history background scream in recognition. Renaissance paintings hung on constructed easels, their colors vivid despite the darkness. Marble sculptures gleamed on pedestals. Display cases held gold and silver objects, jewels that scattered her flashlight into rainbows. At the chamber's center sat a leather journal beside authentication documents covered in official stamps. "Mama, is this treasure?" Emma asked reverently. Sarah opened the journal with trembling fingers. The first entry, dated 3 years ago, read, "If you are reading this, then I am dead, and you have discovered what I have spent my life protecting. These artifacts represent more than monetary value. They are pieces of history stolen by monsters and hidden by heroes." Thomas Fletcher, Sarah's calculations raced. If authentic, they were looking at tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions. "Are we rich now?" Emma whispered. Sarah studied paintings that belonged in the Louvre, sculptures meant for major museums. Fletcher's words echoed, the weight of guardianship. "I think we've found something much more complicated than treasure." The weight of Thomas Fletcher's journal felt impossibly heavy in Sarah's hands as she and Emma sat in the castle's great hall 3 days later, waiting for Dr. Blackwood to arrive. They'd spent those days in careful exploration of the hidden chamber, cataloging artifacts that Sarah's art history training identified as potentially priceless. Emma had befriended a local boy named Jamie Ross, whose grandmother lived in Glenmore. Jamie possessed that peculiar mixture of Highland mysticism and practical knowledge that came from generations of living in the shadow of ancient stones. "My gran says the castle's cursed," Jamie told Emma as they explored the overgrown gardens. "Says strange men have been asking about it in the village for years. Always foreigners, always willing to pay good money for information." Sarah's blood chilled. If strangers had been inquiring about Castle Ravenshollow for years, then Fletcher's fears about dangerous interest might be more than paranoia. When Dr. Blackwood's red car appeared in the courtyard, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They needed expert help, but revealing the truth would expand the circle of knowledge about their discovery. "Dr. Blackwood," Sarah called as the older woman approached. "Thank you for coming." Margaret Blackwood studied Sarah's face with sharp eyes. "You sounded urgent on the phone. Has something happened?" Sarah exchanged glances with Emma, who nodded encouragingly. "We found something in the castle, something that belonged to Thomas Fletcher." Dr. Blackwood's expression grew serious. "Show me." Leading Dr. Blackwood through the castle to the tower felt like crossing a point of no return. Each step on the spiral stairs carried them closer to trusting someone Sarah barely knew with a secret that could change their lives forever. In the hidden chamber, Dr. Blackwood's scholarly composure cracked completely. Her hands trembled as she examined paintings that Sarah suspected were worth millions individually. "Dear God," Dr. Blackwood whispered, studying a small canvas that bore the unmistakable techniques of a Renaissance master. This is impossible." This painting was listed as destroyed in Berlin, 1943. Sarah handed her Fletcher's journal. "He left this. It explains everything." Dr. Blackwood read in complete silence, her face growing paler with each page. When she finished, she sank into Fletcher's chair and stared at the artifacts surrounding them. "Thomas's grandfather was Robert Fletcher," she said quietly. "He worked for the British government during the war, part of a unit tasked with recovering stolen art. According to this journal, Robert discovered that several high-ranking Nazis had hidden collections throughout Scotland before fleeing. This castle was one of those hiding places. But why didn't Robert turn everything over to authorities?" Sarah asked. Dr. Blackwood turned another page. "Because he realized the paperwork had been falsified. These weren't just stolen from museums. They were taken from Jewish families who had been murdered. The official recovery program would have returned them to German museums, not to survivors or their descendants. Emma, who had been listening with the intense focus she brought to important conversations, spoke up. So he hid them to keep them safe? Exactly, Dr. Blackwood confirmed. And Thomas spent his entire adult life researching the original owners, trying to determine where each piece truly belonged. Sarah felt the weight of moral complexity settling on her shoulders. So we're not just rich. We're guardians of stolen history. Worse than that, Dr. Blackwood said, her voice grim. According to these notes, Thomas believed he was being watched in his final years. He writes about suspicious characters asking questions in the village, about sensing that someone was close to discovering the truth. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. Jamie Ross mentioned that strangers have been asking about the castle for years. Dr. Blackwood nodded grimly. Thomas was paranoid, but that doesn't mean he was wrong. Collection like this, ours to keep. Dr. Blackwood looked at her with something approaching respect. Thomas would have approved of that sentiment. But returning these pieces safely won't be simple. Look at this entry from last year. She pointed to a passage written in Thomas's careful handwriting. VK was in Edinburgh last month. Sources confirm he's still searching. If he discovers the location, Emma and her mother will be in grave danger. The artifacts must be moved if my security is compromised. Who is VK? Sarah asked. Dr. Blackwood's face was grim. Viktor Kozlov. Thomas mentions him throughout the journal. Former Soviet art recovery specialist who went private after the USSR collapsed. He spent decades tracking down wartime stolen art, but not for noble reasons. He sells to the highest bidder, regardless of legitimate ownership. Sarah felt sick. And he knows about the castle? Thomas seemed to think so. There are entries suggesting Kozlov has been systematically investigating every property connected to wartime art storage. If he hasn't found this place yet, it's only a matter of time. Emma, who had been quietly absorbing this conversation, spoke with startling clarity. So we have to get the treasures to the right people before the bad man finds them? That's exactly right, Dr. Blackwood confirmed. But it's incredibly dangerous. These artifacts represent decades of Kozlov's searching. He won't simply give up because a single mother and her daughter have inconveniently discovered his prize. Sarah looked around the chamber at paintings and sculptures that represented not just enormous wealth, but the stolen heritage of murdered families. The moral weight was clear, but so was the danger. What do you recommend? Sarah asked. Dr. Blackwood was quiet for several minutes, clearly wrestling with the implications. Officially, I should tell you to contact the authorities immediately. Turn everything over to the police and let international agencies sort out the legal ownership. But, Sarah sensed hesitation. But Thomas spent 30 years researching the rightful owners of these pieces. His work represents the most comprehensive investigation into this particular collection. If we turn everything over to bureaucrats, it could disappear into government warehouses for decades while lawyers argue jurisdiction. Emma looked between the two adults. What would Thomas want us to do? Dr. Blackwood smiled sadly. Thomas would want these pieces returned to their families. He would want justice, not bureaucracy. She paused, studying Sarah's face. But he would also want you and Emma to be safe. Sarah felt the weight of decision pressing down on her. They could try to secretly return the artifacts to their rightful owners, honoring Thomas's work and the memory of those who had been murdered. But doing so would put them in direct opposition to dangerous people who had been searching for this collection for decades. Or they could turn everything over to authorities and hope that justice would eventually be served through official channels, knowing that bureaucracy often moved too slowly for aging survivors of the Holocaust. There's something else, Dr. Blackwood said quietly. Thomas mentions in several entries that the collection is incomplete. He believed there were additional pieces hidden elsewhere in the castle. If Kozlov or others are still searching, they might not stop with what we found. Sarah looked at Emma, who was studying a small painting with the intensity she usually reserved for her favorite books. Her daughter had shown remarkable courage and wisdom throughout this ordeal, but she was still 8 years old. She deserved safety, stability, a normal childhood. But she also deserved to grow up in a world where justice mattered more than convenience, where doing the right thing was worth personal risk. Dr. Blackwood, Sarah said carefully, if we decided to help return these pieces to their families, would you help us? The older woman's eyes met hers with steady determination. Sarah, my dear, I've spent my entire career studying history. But history isn't just about the past. It's about how we choose to honor it in the present. She gestured toward the artifacts surrounding them. These pieces represent both the worst and best of humanity. The worst in their theft and the murder of their owners. The best in Thomas's dedication to justice and your willingness to risk safety for what's right. Emma looked up from the painting she'd been studying. Mama, I think we should help the families get their treasures back, even if it's scary. Sarah pulled her daughter close, marveling at the moral clarity that children sometimes possessed. It will be very scary, sweetheart, and very dangerous. I know, Emma said simply. But the people who owned these things first, they were scared too, and they can't speak for themselves anymore. In that moment, surrounded by stolen treasures in a hidden chamber beneath an ancient castle, Sarah realized that their desperate gamble to escape poverty had delivered them to something far more important than financial security. They had been given the opportunity to write a small chapter of justice in a story that had been marked by tragedy for too long. All right, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. We'll find a way to get these pieces back to their families. But we do it carefully and we do it smart. Dr. Blackwood nodded approvingly. Then we begin with Thomas's research, and we prepare for the possibility that we're not the only ones interested in this collection. Outside the castle walls, Highland wind carried the scent of heather and the distant sound of sheep. But inside the hidden chamber, 3 people began planning an operation that would either restore justice to murdered families or deliver them all into the hands of those who had been searching for decades to claim the greatest treasure of their lives. Victor Kozlov arrived in Glenmore on a Tuesday morning, driving a sleek black BMW that looked entirely out of place among the village's weathered stone cottages. He parked outside Mrs. Campbell's tea shop with the casual confidence of someone who belonged everywhere and nowhere. Sarah first heard about him from Jamie's grandmother, who called Dr. Blackwood with barely contained excitement. There's a man asking questions about the castle. Foreign accent. Very polite, very generous with his tips. Says he's an art dealer researching Highland history. Sarah's blood turned to ice. They'd spent a week carefully photographing artifacts and researching Thomas Fletcher's notes about rightful owners. There are people who would kill for it. She flipped through more pages, pointing to entries that detailed Thomas's research. Look at this. He identified several pieces that were stolen from the Rosenberg family in Vienna. Their descendants have been searching for these items since the war ended. And this sculpture, it belonged to a prominent Jewish art dealer in Berlin whose entire family was murdered. Sarah's art history training helped her understand the implications. These aren't just valuable artifacts. They're family heirlooms, pieces of identity that were stolen along with lives. Precisely, Dr. Blackwood said, but they're also worth an astronomical sum on the black market. Thomas estimates the total value at over £200 million. Emma's eyes widened. That's a lot of money. It is, Sarah agreed. But it's not now. Just as they were making progress, the danger Fletcher had feared was materializing. He's here, Sarah told Dr. Blackwood over the phone. Kozlov's found us. Within hours, a second visitor appeared. Lord James Hartwell, descendant of the castle's original family. Unlike Kozlov's subtle approach, Hartwell arrived with legal documents and barely contained desperation, demanding ownership of his family's ancestral property and all its contents. Sarah watched from the castle's upper windows as both men circled like predators, each believing they had legitimate claims to the treasure hidden beneath ancient stones. Detective Inspector Claire MacLeod's arrival that evening completed the triangle of threat. Local police had been alerted to suspicious activity. Strangers asking pointed questions, legal challenges to property ownership, rumors of valuable discoveries. Mrs. Martinez, McLeod said carefully. I understand you've had some interesting visitors today. The confrontation began at dawn when Sarah found Viktor Kozlov standing in the castle's courtyard, studying the ancient walls with the calculated interest of someone mapping defensive positions. He wore an expensive coat that made no concessions to Highland weather, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the morning mist. Ms. Martinez, he called, his accent carrying the cultured tones of someone equally comfortable in Moscow boardrooms and London auction houses. I was hoping we could have a conversation. Sarah's protective instincts flared. Emma was still sleeping in their makeshift bedroom, and Dr. Blackwood wouldn't arrive for another hour. She was alone with a man Thomas Fletcher had feared enough to spend decades hiding from. The castle isn't open for tours, Sarah said carefully, staying near the entrance where she could retreat if necessary. Kozlov's smile was pleasant, practiced, and completely without warmth. I'm not interested in tourism, Ms. Martinez. I'm interested in history, specifically the history of what Thomas Fletcher may have left behind. The words hung in the Highland air like a challenge. Sarah realized that pretending ignorance was pointless. Kozlov's presence meant he already knew more than she was comfortable with. I don't know what you're talking about, she said anyway. Of course you don't. Kozlov moved closer, his movements fluid and controlled. You're an American single mother who bought a castle on impulse. What could you possibly know about wartime art recovery or the activities of the Fletcher family during the 1940s? Each word was chosen for maximum impact, designed to let Sarah know exactly how much he'd already learned about their situation. Her art history background, her financial desperation, her impulsive purchase, he'd done his research. However, Kozlov continued, Thomas Fletcher spent 30 years researching a very specific collection of artifacts. Items that rightfully belong to those of us who have been searching for them far longer than he ever did. And what gives you the right to claim them? Sarah asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Kozlov's expression shifted, revealing something harder beneath the cultured facade. My grandfather died in Stalingrad fighting the Nazis who stole those pieces. My father spent his career with Soviet art recovery, tracking down treasures that were looted from our allies. I have dedicated my life to reclaiming what was stolen from the people. By selling them to private collectors? Sarah challenged. His smile turned sharp. By ensuring they go to those who truly appreciate their value, rather than gathering dust in bureaucratic warehouses while lawyers argue about ownership for decades. The sound of another car approaching interrupted their tense conversation. Lord James Hartwell emerged from a Range Rover that looked like it had seen better decades, his aristocratic bearing undermined by clothes that were expensive but frayed at the edges. What's the meaning of this? Hartwell demanded, studying Kozlov with obvious suspicion. This is private property. My family's private property. Kozlov turned to assess this new player with predatory interest. Lord Hartwell, I presume. Your reputation precedes you. Sarah felt the situation spiraling beyond her control. Two men who believed they had legitimate claims to her discovery were now facing off in her courtyard, while she stood between them with no legal protection and an 8-year-old daughter sleeping inside. Neither of you has any right to be here, Sarah said firmly. I own this castle legally, and whatever it contains is mine to decide about. Hartwell's laugh was bitter. You own it because you took advantage of an auction that should never have happened. That castle has been in my family for 400 years. Whatever Fletcher hid there belongs to the Hartwell estate. Your family sold the castle in 1982, Kozlov observed mildly. Poor financial decisions invalidate ancestral claims, Lord Hartwell. Trust me, I've researched the legal precedents thoroughly. And I suppose your claim is more legitimate? Hartwell shot back. My claim is based on decades of professional art recovery work and substantial financial investment in locating these specific pieces, Kozlov replied. Unlike Ms. Martinez's accidental discovery or your nostalgic delusions about hereditary rights. Sarah watched the two men circle each other verbally and realized that their conflict might be her only advantage. As long as they were focused on competing claims, they weren't united against her. Gentlemen, she said, injecting authority into her voice that she'd learned from years of dealing with difficult hospital administrators. "This is getting us nowhere. If you have legitimate legal claims, you can present them through proper channels." "Legal channels take time," Kozlov said quietly. "And there are others who know about Fletcher's research. Other interested parties who might not be as civilized as Lord Hartwell and myself." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with Highland weather. At that moment, Dr. Blackwood's red car appeared on the track leading to the castle, followed closely by a police vehicle. Detective Inspector McLeod had arrived earlier than expected, and Sarah wasn't sure if that was good or bad news. "It appears our conversation will have to continue later," Kozlov said, checking his expensive watch. "But Ms. Martinez, I hope you understand that this matter won't simply disappear. Some things are too valuable to remain hidden forever." He walked toward his BMW with casual confidence, nodding politely to Dr. Blackwood and Detective McLeod as they approached. His message was clear. He would be back, and next time he might not be so patient. Hartwell lingered longer, studying the castle with desperate longing. "My great-grandfather built the Tower Addition," he said quietly. "My family hosted kings in that great hall. This isn't just about money, Ms. Martinez. It's about legacy." Sarah felt an unexpected moment of sympathy for him. Unlike Kozlov's calculated menace, Hartwell's desperation seemed genuine, driven by pride and family history rather than simple greed. "Lord Hartwell," she said carefully, "if there are family heirlooms here, we can discuss." "There are no family heirlooms," he interrupted bitterly. "My ancestors sold everything of value decades ago. But whatever Fletcher hid, it represents my only chance to restore what was lost." His eyes met hers with startling honesty. "I'm not a good man, Ms. Martinez, but I'm not evil either. I'm just desperate." After he drove away, Sarah stood alone in the courtyard until Dr. Blackwood and Detective McLeod reached her. The inspector was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of the castle's facade. "Mrs. Martinez," McLeod said without preamble, "I understand you've been having some interesting conversations this morning." Sarah realized that whatever protection anonymity might have provided was gone. The castle was now the focus of multiple competing interests, each more dangerous than anything she'd faced in Chicago. "Inspector," she said carefully, "I think we need to talk." As they walked toward the castle entrance, Sarah heard Emma's voice calling from an upper window. Her daughter was awake, ready to face another day of adventure in their fairy tale castle. But Sarah understood now that some fairy tales came with monsters that no amount of courage could wish away. The siege of Castle Ravenshollow had begun, and she wasn't sure anyone would escape unscathed. The attack came at midnight 3 days after Detective Inspector McLeod's first visit. Sarah woke to the sound of glass breaking somewhere in the castle's lower levels. Not the random crash of old windows finally surrendering to Highland weather, but the deliberate shattering of someone forcing entry. She rolled from their makeshift bed and shook Emma awake. "Baby, we need to be very quiet and very brave. Someone's in the castle." Emma's eyes snapped open with the alertness of a child who had learned too young that danger was real. "Is it the bad man?" "I don't know," Sarah whispered, pulling on clothes and stuffing their most essential belongings into a backpack. "But we're going to use those secret passages you found. Remember the one behind the tapestry on the second floor?" Emma nodded, her small face serious in the moonlight streaming through their window. They crept through corridors Sarah had memorized during weeks of exploration, her flashlight dark to avoid detection. Below them, she could hear voices. Multiple intruders moving through the great hall with the confident sound of people who knew exactly what they were looking for. "The tower," one voice said in accented English that Sarah recognized as Kozlov's. Fletcher's journal indicated the hiding place would be in the oldest part of the structure. Sarah's heart sank. Kozlov hadn't just found the castle. He'd found Thomas Fletcher's research notes, probably hidden somewhere they'd missed. He knew about the secret chamber. "This is madness," another voice protested. Sarah recognized Lord Hartwell's aristocratic tones, though they now carried a note of panic. Breaking and entering, working with criminals. This isn't what I agreed to. You agreed to help me locate the artifacts in exchange for a finder's fee that would restore your family's fortune, Kozlov replied coldly. How we accomplish that goal is my concern. Sarah felt sick. Hartwell had allied himself with Kozlov, his desperation overriding whatever moral compass he might have possessed. They weren't dealing with competing claims anymore. They were facing a united front of dangerous men who had come prepared for violence. She guided Emma to the hidden passage behind the crumbling tapestry, a narrow space between walls that Emma had discovered during her fearless explorations. The passage connected several floors and offered multiple exit points. Medieval builders had designed them as escape routes during sieges. Mama, Emma whispered as they squeezed through the cramped space. Should we call the police? Sarah checked her phone. No signal, as usual in the castle's thick walls. Even if she could call, Detective McLeod was based 20 miles away in the nearest town. Help would arrive too late. They emerged from the passage on the ground floor, in a storage room that connected to the kitchen. Through gaps in the stone walls, Sarah could hear the intruders climbing toward the tower. She had perhaps 10 minutes before they discovered the hidden chamber and realized the artifacts weren't there anymore. Because over the past 3 days, working with Dr. Blackwood's help, they had moved the most valuable pieces to a new hiding place. Not trusting the original chamber's security after Kozlov's arrival, Sarah had relocated key artifacts to a space Emma had found beneath the kitchen, a medieval storage area that had been forgotten for centuries. Stay close to me, Sarah told Emma as they crept toward the kitchen. If anything happens, you run to the village and find Dr. Blackwood. Don't try to help me, just get safe. I'm not leaving you, Emma said with the stubborn courage that made Sarah proud and terrified in equal measure. They reached the kitchen just as Sarah heard Kozlov's voice echo from the tower above. The chamber is empty. Someone moved them. The fury in his voice made Sarah's blood freeze. An empty hiding place meant they'd lost their advantage, and Kozlov's anger would make him even more dangerous. Search the entire castle, Kozlov ordered. They have to be here somewhere. The woman and child couldn't have moved everything far. Heavy footsteps began descending from the tower, spreading out to search the castle systematically. Sarah realized they had minutes before discovery, and nowhere left to run. That's when Emma tugged her sleeve and pointed to the floor. The entrance to their new hiding place was concealed beneath a heavy stone slab that looked like part of the kitchen's original construction. Below it lay the artifacts they'd moved, and more importantly, a space large enough for both of them to hide. Emma, no, Sarah whispered. If they find us down there, we'll be trapped. But footsteps were approaching the kitchen, and they were out of options. Emma had already begun working the mechanism that opened the hidden entrance, another of the castle's carefully engineered secrets that she discovered through patient exploration. They dropped into darkness just as the kitchen door opened above them. Sarah pulled the stone slab closed over their heads, praying the mechanism would work from inside. The space was cramped, filled with artifacts worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and now serving as their tomb if Kozlov decided to search thoroughly. They were definitely here, Kozlov's voice filtered down through stone. Fresh food in the pantry, warm ashes in the fireplace. But where would they go? Maybe they ran to the village when they heard us coming, Hartwell suggested hopefully. Perhaps. But more likely they're still in the castle, hiding like mice. Kozlov's voice carried a note of cruel amusement. Search every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. And check the walls. Castles like this always have more secrets than are immediately obvious. Sarah held Emma close in the darkness, both of them barely breathing. Around them, Renaissance masterpieces and priceless artifacts waited in silent testimony to the horrors that greed could inspire. She thought of Thomas Fletcher, who had spent 30 years protecting these treasures from men exactly like Kozlov. Above them, systematic searching continued. Furniture being moved, stones being tested, walls being struck to check for hollow spaces. Kozlov was thorough, professional, and patient. Sarah began to understand that he would eventually find them. That's when she heard a new sound, car engines approaching the castle. Multiple vehicles moving fast. Through the stone above them, She heard Kozlov curse in what sounded like Russian. "Police," Hartwell said, panic clear in his voice. "Someone called the police." "Impossible," Kozlov replied, but his voice had lost its confident edge. "No one knew we were coming." Car doors slammed in the courtyard. Multiple voices, official and authoritative. Sarah heard Detective Inspector McLeod's crisp Scottish accent. "Armed police. Castle is surrounded. Exit the building with your hands visible." In their hidden chamber, Sarah felt Emma's small hand squeeze hers. Somehow help had arrived. But they weren't safe yet. Kozlov was trapped, desperate, and had already demonstrated his willingness to use violence. "There's another way out," Hartwell said urgently. "The old servant's passage from the pantry. We can reach the stables without being seen." "And leave behind decades of searching?" Kozlov's voice turned dangerous. "I don't think so. If I can't have the artifacts, I'll make sure no one can. Starting with the woman and child who've caused all this trouble." Sarah's blood froze. Kozlov knew they were still in the castle, and his patience had run out. Above them, she heard him speaking to someone else. Accomplices she hadn't known about. "Find them," he ordered. "And when you do, make sure they can't interfere with our work again." In the darkness beneath the kitchen, surrounded by stolen treasures and holding her daughter close, Sarah Martinez realized that their desperate gamble to escape poverty had led them to the most dangerous moment of their lives. The confrontation was far from over. It was about to become a fight for survival. Outside, police voices continued coordinating their response. Inside, dangerous men searched for the woman and child who stood between them and a fortune worth dying for. And in the hidden chamber beneath it all, a mother prepared to do whatever was necessary to protect the daughter who had discovered the secret that changed everything. The battle for Castle Ravensshallow's treasures had become a battle for their lives. 2 weeks after Kozlov's arrest, Sarah sat across from Detective Inspector McLeod in the castle's Great Hall, facing the most complex legal situation of her life. The massive wooden table that had once hosted medieval feasts was now covered with legal documents, photographs of artifacts, and testimony from 3 different government agencies. "This is unprecedented," McLeod said, rubbing her temples as she reviewed another stack of international ownership claims. "We have Holocaust survivors' families from 7 different countries claiming pieces. 3 major museums insisting certain items were stolen from their collections. The Russian government demanding everything that Kozlov was after. And the German government claiming jurisdiction over wartime art theft." Emma sat nearby, carefully copying passages from Thomas Fletcher's journal that Dr. Blackwood had determined were crucial to establishing provenance. Her 8-year-old handwriting was meticulous, and she approached the task with the same focused intensity she'd shown when exploring the castle's secrets. "What about Lord Hartwell?" Sarah asked. "Has he been released?" "This morning," McLeod confirmed. "The prosecutor decided that his cooperation against Kozlov outweighed his role in the break-in. He's agreed to withdraw all legal claims to the castle in exchange for avoiding charges." Sarah felt a complex mixture of relief and sympathy. Hartwell had made terrible choices driven by desperation, but his conscience had ultimately prevented him from participating in violence. When Kozlov's accomplices had produced weapons during the standoff, Hartwell had broken down completely, screaming at police that he'd never intended for anyone to be hurt. "But that still leaves us with the bigger problem," Dr. Blackwood said, entering the hall carrying a thick folder of research. "I've been working with international art recovery experts, and the legal ownership of these pieces is extraordinarily complicated." She spread photographs across the table showing some of the most valuable artifacts. This Caravaggio was stolen from the Rosenberg family in Vienna in 1938. Their granddaughter lives in New York and has been searching for it her entire life. But it was also catalogued by the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg as missing from their collection. "How is that possible?" Sarah asked. "The Nazis were systematic looters," Dr. Blackwood explained. "They stole from Jewish families, then donated many pieces to German museums to legitimize ownership. When the Soviets liberated Berlin, they took everything they could find back to Russia. The Rosenbergs' Caravaggio was stolen 3 times, once from the family, once from a German museum, and once from the Soviets. Emma looked up from her copying. So who really owns it? That's the question that could take courts decades to answer, MacLeod said grimly. And meanwhile, you're sitting on a collection worth hundreds of millions of pounds, making you a target for every art thief and treasure hunter in the world. Sarah had been dreading this conversation, but she'd also been preparing for it. Over the past 2 weeks, she'd studied Thomas Fletcher's research with the same intensity she'd once brought to graduate school. More importantly, she'd listened to Emma's simple but profound observations about right and wrong. "I've made a decision," Sarah said quietly, "about what to do with the artifacts." The room fell silent. MacLeod stopped shuffling papers. Dr. Blackwood looked up from her research, and Emma set down her pencil to give her mother full attention. "Thomas Fletcher spent 30 years researching the rightful owners of these pieces," Sarah continued. "His work identified families, documented theft, and established moral ownership even when legal ownership remained complicated. I want to honor that work." "How?" Dr. Blackwood asked softly. "I want to establish a foundation, the Fletcher Foundation for Art Restitution. We'll use the artifacts to create a permanent fund that can research ownership, facilitate returns to rightful families, and support Holocaust education programs." MacLeod frowned. "Sarah, you realize this means giving up potentially hundreds of millions of pounds? The legal system might eventually award you significant compensation as the legitimate purchaser." "I know," Sarah said, "but Emma and I didn't buy this castle to become rich. We bought it to escape poverty and find a home. We have both of those things now." Emma beamed at her mother with pride that made Sarah's heart ache with love and hope. "Besides," Sarah continued, "Thomas Fletcher's journal makes his intentions clear. He wrote, 'These artifacts represent more than monetary value. They are pieces of identity stolen from murdered families.' He wanted them returned, not sold." Dr. Blackwood was quiet for several minutes, clearly moved by Sarah's decision. "The legal complexity would still be enormous," she finally said. "Setting up such a foundation, establishing its authority to make ownership decisions, securing the artifacts during the process. Which is why I need help," Sarah admitted, "from people who understand art history, international law, and moral responsibility." "You want me to help you give away a fortune?" Dr. Blackwood said with something approaching wonder. "Most people in your situation would hire the best lawyers they could afford and fight for every penny. Most people didn't find these treasures the way we did," Sarah replied. "Emma discovered them by exploring with the curiosity of a child who loves castles and adventure. But we learned their significance by reading the journal of a man who spent his life protecting them. We're guardians, not owners." Emma spoke up with the clarity that sometimes amazed Sarah. "The families who lost these things, they're still sad about them, aren't they? Even after all these years?" "Yes, sweetheart," Dr. Blackwood confirmed gently. "Many of them are." "Then we should give them back," Emma said simply. "It's the right thing to do." MacLeod shook her head in disbelief. "You're talking about the largest voluntary art restitution in modern history. The precedent this would set, the international attention it would draw. Are you prepared for that kind of scrutiny?" Sarah thought about their journey from a cramped Chicago apartment to this moment in a Highland castle, making decisions that would affect families around the world. "Inspector, 6 months ago I was cleaning hospital floors at midnight to pay rent. Now I'm sitting in my own castle, discussing how to return stolen masterpieces to Holocaust survivors. I think I can handle a little scrutiny." "There would be benefits," Dr. Blackwood said thoughtfully. "The foundation could partner with major museums for traveling exhibitions. The educational component could ensure these pieces tell their complete stories, not just artistic significance, but historical context. And Sarah, you would be the foundation's director. It would be meaningful work, well-compensated work." "What about the people who might still come looking for the treasure?" Emma asked with practical concern. "The bad men like Mr. Kozlov?" MacLeod smiled grimly. "Once the artifacts are publicly documented and distributed to museums worldwide, they lose their black market value. Criminals prefer treasures they can steal and sell quietly. It's much harder to fence a painting that's hanging in the Smithsonian. Sarah felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't realized she was carrying. The constant fear of discovery, the moral complexity of ownership, the target their secret had painted on their backs. All of it could be resolved through transparency and justice. "There's one more thing," Sarah said. "I want the Foundation's first exhibition to be here, at Castle Raven's Hollow. A temporary display showing some of the artifacts before they go to their permanent homes. People should see where they were hidden, understand Thomas Fletcher's story, and learn about the families they belong to." "Turn the castle into a museum?" Dr. Blackwood asked. "Temporarily. Just long enough to tell the complete story properly." Sarah looked around the great hall, imagining it filled with visitors learning about art, history, and the power of individual conscience. Thomas Fletcher protected these treasures in secret for 30 years. I think they deserve to have their story told in the light. Emma clapped her hands together. "Can I be a tour guide? I know all the secret passages." For the first time since Kozlov's arrest, Sarah laughed freely. "I think that can be arranged." MacLeod gathered her paperwork with the efficiency of someone who had witnessed bureaucratic miracles before. "I'll need to make some calls. International art restitution foundations require approvals from multiple agencies. But Sarah, what you're proposing, it's extraordinary." "It's the right thing to do," Sarah said, echoing her daughter's simple wisdom. "And sometimes that's the same thing as extraordinary." As the meeting concluded and preparations began for what would become one of the most significant art restitution cases in history, Sarah watched Emma return to copying Thomas Fletcher's careful handwriting. Her daughter had discovered a secret that changed their lives, but more importantly, she'd learned that some discoveries came with responsibilities larger than personal gain. Outside the castle walls, Highland wind carried the promise of spring. Inside, a mother and daughter continued the work of guardianship, ensuring that stolen treasures would find their way home to the families who had never stopped missing them. The greatest treasure, Sarah realized, wasn't the artifacts they'd found. It was the opportunity to write a story of justice in a world that didn't always provide second chances. 6 months after establishing the Fletcher Foundation, Sarah stood in the castle's great hall watching the first official ceremony return a stolen masterpiece to its rightful family. The Rosenberg Caravaggio, hidden for over 80 years, was about to go home. Rachel Rosenberg Cohen, a 73-year-old woman from New York, held her great-grandmother's painting with trembling hands while tears streamed down her face. "My great-grandmother used to tell me stories about this painting," she whispered to Sarah. "How it hung in their dining room in Vienna. How my great-grandfather saved for 3 years to buy it. The Nazis took everything, but she never stopped describing this exact scene to me." Emma watched from nearby, wearing the small badge that identified her as an official junior curator of the foundation. At 9 now, she had become the castle's most knowledgeable guide, leading visitors through the secret passages and explaining how she discovered the hidden chamber. "Mrs. Cohen," Emma said with the serious formality she used for important occasions, "would you like to see where we found it? The secret room is really interesting." Dr. Blackwood, now the Foundation's academic director, approached with a folder of documentation. "We've identified 11 other pieces that belong to your family, Rachel. The Foundation will arrange their return as soon as current exhibitions are complete." The ceremony took place in a great hall transformed by careful restoration. Working with historians and craftsmen, Sarah had returned the space to something approximating its medieval glory while adding modern amenities for the Foundation's work. Tapestries hung on stone walls, their colors bright and new but historically accurate. The massive wooden table now served as a conference space for international art recovery meetings. "Sarah," Rachel said, still cradling the painting, "I need you to understand something. My family lost everything in the war. Everything except stories. This painting. It's not just art to me. It's proof that we existed, that we mattered, that we had beautiful things and loved them." Sarah felt the familiar weight of responsibility that had become central to her new life. The foundation had returned 17 pieces to their original families so far, with 43 more documented and in process. Each return was an individual story of loss, survival, and restoration. "I understand," Sarah said quietly. "That's why Thomas Fletcher protected them. That's why we're continuing his work." Lord Hartwell appeared in the doorway, dressed in work clothes and carrying a box of newly catalogued documents. His transformation had been as dramatic as anyone's, from desperate would-be thief to the Foundation's most dedicated volunteer researcher. His family knowledge of Highland history and his connections to British archives had proven invaluable. "Sarah," he called, "I found something remarkable in the Edinburgh records, evidence of 3 more collections hidden in Scottish castles during the war. The Fletcher network was larger than we thought." The discovery had transformed their understanding of Thomas Fletcher's work. Rather than operating alone, he had been part of a network of people throughout Scotland who had protected stolen art from both Nazi thieves and bureaucratic indifference. The Fletcher Foundation was now coordinating with similar discoveries across the Highlands. "How much more is out there?" Emma asked with the practical curiosity that had started everything. "We may never know," Dr. Blackwood admitted. "But every piece we find is another family's heritage restored." Detective Inspector MacLeod arrived as the ceremony was concluding, carrying official papers and wearing the satisfied expression of someone whose case files were finally complete. Viktor Kozlov's trial had ended 2 weeks earlier with a conviction for international art theft, breaking and entering, and attempted assault. He would spend the next 15 years in prison, his network of criminal contacts dismantled by international law enforcement. "Sarah," MacLeod said, "I wanted to give you these personally." She handed over legal documents that made Sarah's ownership of Castle Ravenshollow completely uncontested. "The Scottish government has officially recognized the Foundation's work and your stewardship of the castle. You're not just legal owners now, you're protected cultural guardians." Emma beamed with pride. "Does that mean we get to stay forever?" "If you want to," MacLeod confirmed. "Though I suspect you'll be too busy traveling to spend much time here. The requests for Foundation partnerships are coming from museums worldwide." It was true. In 6 months, the Fletcher Foundation had received collaboration requests from institutions in 12 countries. Sarah had been invited to speak at conferences in London, Berlin, and Washington about ethical art restitution. Emma had become something of a celebrity, featured in museum magazines as the girl who discovered the greatest treasure trove of our time. But the real transformation was in their daily life. Sarah woke each morning in a castle that was truly their home, working on projects that used every aspect of her education and experience. Emma attended the village school in Glenmore, where she was known as the girl who lived in the castle and helped return stolen treasures to their families. "Mama," Emma said as the ceremony concluded and guests began to leave, "do you think we made the right choice, giving away all that money?" Sarah looked around the great hall, at the life they had built from their desperate gamble. She thought about their old apartment in Chicago, the eviction notices, the constant fear of not having enough. Then she looked at Emma, confident and purposeful in ways that had nothing to do with money. "Emma, do you remember what you said when we first found the artifacts? About how some treasures are worth more than money?" Emma nodded. "Because the families needed them back." "That's right. And what we built here, the foundation, our work, the families we've helped. That's the real treasure. We're not just rich now, sweetheart. We're rich in the right ways." Dr. Blackwood joined them, carrying a letter that had arrived that morning. "Sarah, this came from the Goldstein family in Berlin. The foundation returned their grandfather's sculpture last month." She read aloud, "Dear Ms. Martinez and Emma, thank you for giving us back a piece of our family we thought was lost forever. Our grandfather would be so proud to know that his sculpture is home, displayed in our house where our children can see it every day. You have given us more than art, you have given us back part of our history." Emma listened with the serious attention she gave to all stories about the families they helped. "That's why we do this work, isn't it? Because it makes people happy in important ways." "Exactly," Sarah said, pulling her daughter close. "Some kinds of happiness you can't buy, no matter how much money you have. As evening fell over the Highland castle, Sarah and Emma stood in the tower where everything began. The secret chamber below now served as a climate-controlled storage space for artifacts awaiting return. The artifacts they kept for exhibitions were displayed with full documentation of their histories, their theft, and their recovery. "What do you think Thomas Fletcher would say about what we've done?" Emma asked. Sarah considered the question seriously. She'd thought about Thomas Fletcher often over the past 6 months, about his 30 years of solitary guardianship and his hope that someone would continue his work. "I think he'd be proud that his secrets became stories, that the artifacts he protected are finally going home, and that a little girl's curiosity turned his hidden treasure into justice for families all over the world." Emma smiled, the same bright expression she'd worn when first discovering the secret passage. "I'm glad we bought this castle, Mama, even if we didn't know what we were doing. Sometimes the best decisions are the ones we make without knowing all the consequences," Sarah agreed. "Sometimes you just have to trust that the adventure will teach you what you need to learn." Outside their tower windows, Highland stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Inside the castle that had become their home, a mother and daughter continued the work of guardianship, ensuring that stolen treasures found their way back to the people who had never stopped missing them. They had bought a castle for $500 and discovered a treasure worth $280 million. But the real treasure had been learning that some responsibilities were privileges, and some choices were worth more than any amount of money could buy. 1 year after their first desperate night in Castle Ravenshollow, Sarah Martinez stood in the restored tower chamber where Emma had made the discovery that changed everything. The room now served as the Foundation's research center, its ancient stone walls lined with modern technology and climate-controlled display cases. Emma, now 10 and growing taller each month, was explaining the castle's history to a delegation from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Her confidence had blossomed over the past year, transforming from a curious child into a poised young woman who spoke with authority about art history, wartime theft, and the moral complexities of cultural preservation. "The secret chamber was right below us," Emma told the visitors, pointing to the floor. "But you can't see it anymore because we made it into a proper museum storage room. Would you like to see where we display the artifacts that are waiting to go home?" Sarah watched her daughter with the quiet pride of a mother who had witnessed extraordinary growth. Emma attended the village school but spent afternoons and weekends at the castle, working as the Foundation's youngest curator. She had developed a particular expertise in medieval architecture and Nazi art theft, subjects that most 10-year-olds never encountered but that had become central to her understanding of justice and responsibility. Dr. Blackwood emerged from the research library they'd established in what was once the castle's armory. At 70, she had found new purpose in directing the Foundation's academic work, collaborating with universities and museums worldwide. Her silver hair was now complemented by the satisfied expression of someone whose life's work had gained international recognition. "Sarah," Dr. Blackwood called, "I have news. The Berlin Museum has confirmed authentication of the Monet we documented last month. That brings our total verified returns to 67 pieces, worth approximately £320 million. The numbers still took Sarah's breath away. In 1 year, the Fletcher Foundation had become the most successful voluntary art restitution organization in history. But more meaningful than the monetary value were the letters they received from families who had recovered pieces of their heritage they'd thought lost forever. Lord Hartwell appeared in the doorway, his transformation perhaps the most remarkable of anyone's. Gone was the desperate, entitled aristocrat who had once allied himself with criminals. In his place stood a man who had found dignity through service, managing the Foundation's extensive archives and using his family connections to locate additional hidden collections throughout Scotland. "Sarah, there's someone here to see you," Hartwell said, his voice carrying excitement. "Someone very special." The visitor was an elderly man in his 80s, accompanied by a younger woman who Sarah recognized from photographs as his granddaughter. But it was the man himself who made Sarah's heart skip. He bore an unmistakable resemblance to Thomas Fletcher. "Ms. Martinez," the old man said in a voice that carried traces of a Scottish accent softened by decades in America, "I'm Robert Fletcher. Thomas was my cousin. I've come to see what you've done with his life's work. Sarah felt Emma slip beside her, instinctively understanding the significance of this meeting. Robert Fletcher had been mentioned throughout Thomas's journal as the only family member who knew about the hidden artifacts, the only person Thomas had trusted with fragments of the truth. "Mr. Fletcher," Sarah said carefully, "Thomas left very detailed instructions about his intentions for the collection. We've tried to honor them." Robert's weathered face creased into a smile. "My dear, from what I've read about the foundation, you've done far more than honor them. You've completed them." He gestured around the restored chamber. "Thomas spent 30 years hiding these treasures from the world. You've spent 1 year giving them back to the world. That's exactly what he would have wanted." They walked through the castle together, Robert sharing stories about his cousin that brought Thomas Fletcher to life in ways his journal couldn't capture. He told them about Thomas's childhood obsession with medieval history, his devastation when he learned about his grandfather's secret burden, his decades of solitary research driven by a sense of inherited responsibility. "He never married," Robert said as they stood in the great hall where families had been reunited with stolen treasures. "Never had children, but he used to say that someday the right people would find his work and continue it. He believed that the castle would choose its own guardians when the time was right." Emma looked up at Robert with the serious expression she wore when processing important information. "Do you think we're the right people?" Robert studied Emma for a long moment, taking in her confidence, her knowledge, her obvious love for the castle and its history. "My dear child, I think you're exactly who Thomas was waiting for." That evening, after the delegation had departed and the castle had returned to its peaceful rhythm, Sarah stood on the battlements watching sunset paint the Highland sky in shades of gold and rose. A year ago, she had been a desperate single mother facing eviction and financial ruin. Tonight, she was the director of an internationally recognized foundation, living in a castle that had become a symbol of ethical responsibility in the art world. Emma joined her on the battlements, carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate from the kitchen that now boasted modern appliances alongside its medieval charm. They had found their rhythm in this place, balancing the demands of foundation work with the simple pleasures of castle life. "Mama," Emma said, settling beside her mother to watch the sunset, "do you ever miss Chicago?" Sarah considered the question seriously. She thought about their old apartment, the cramped space and constant worry, the night shifts and mounting bills. But she also thought about the journey that had brought them here, the desperation that had led to an impulsive auction bid, the courage that had carried them across an ocean to an unknown future. "I miss who we were becoming there," Sarah said carefully. "The mother and daughter who were brave enough to bet everything on a castle we'd never seen. But I love who we've become here. Because we help people," Emma observed. "Because we learned that some treasures are only valuable when they're shared," Sarah corrected gently. "The artifacts we return, the families we reunite with their heritage, the history we preserve, none of that would matter if we kept it to ourselves." Jamie Ross appeared on the battlements, now 11 and one of Emma's closest friends. His grandmother had become the foundation's volunteer coordinator, managing the steady stream of researchers, reporters, and visitors who came to learn about their work. "Emma," Jamie called, "my gran says there's another letter from a family in Amsterdam. They think one of the paintings might have belonged to their great-uncle." Emma's face lit up with the excitement that had driven her exploration of the castle from the beginning. "Another family to help," she said, already heading toward the stairs. As the children disappeared into the castle, chattering about research strategies and historical documentation, Sarah remained on the battlements. The Highland evening was settling into its deep quiet, punctuated only by the distant sound of sheep and the whisper of wind through ancient stones. She thought about Viktor Kozlov, serving his prison sentence and stripped of the artifacts he'd spent decades pursuing. She thought about Lord Hartwell, who had found redemption through service rather than ownership. She thought about Dr. Blackwood, whose academic career had gained new purpose through practical application. Most of all, she thought about Thomas Fletcher, the reclusive historian who had spent 30 years protecting treasures he never intended to keep. His journal had become the foundation's guiding document, its pages filled with meticulous research and moral clarity about the difference between legal ownership and rightful heritage. In the distance, the lights of Glenmore Village twinkled like earthbound stars. The community that had initially viewed them with suspicion now embraced them as neighbors who had brought honor and international attention to their small Highland community. The foundation employed 12 local residents and brought thousands of visitors each year, transforming the village's economy while preserving its character. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from a museum director in Washington, requesting partnership on an exhibition about wartime art recovery. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families to help, new artifacts to research and return. The work would continue, growing and evolving as more collections were discovered and more families reconnected with their stolen heritage. But tonight, in the quiet of Highland evening, Sarah Martinez stood in her castle and marveled at the journey that had brought them here. They had bought a crumbling ruin with their last $500 and discovered that some gambles led to purposes larger than their original intentions. Emma's laughter echoed from somewhere deep within the castle walls, joined by Jamie's voice and the sounds of children who felt completely at home in a place where history lived and breathed. They were growing up surrounded by stories of courage and justice, learning that individual choices could have consequences that rippled across generations. As stars appeared in the darkening sky, Sarah felt the deep contentment that came from knowing they had found their place in the world. Not just a home, but a mission. Not just safety, but purpose. Not just survival, but the opportunity to write a story of justice in a world that desperately needed more such stories. The castle that had sheltered them in desperation now stood as a beacon of ethical responsibility. The treasure that had been hidden in fear now brought light to families around the world. And the woman who had once cleaned floors at midnight to pay rent now directed an international foundation dedicated to returning stolen heritage to those who had never stopped mourning its loss. Some fairy tales, Sarah realized, weren't about finding happily ever after. They were about discovering that the greatest magic lay in using whatever gifts you possessed, curiosity, courage, compassion, to make the world a little more just than you found it. In Castle Ravenshollow, under Highland stars, that magic continued to work its quiet wonders, one returned treasure at a time. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.